All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our follow-up to our Is an ESOP Right for You webinar. It was very well attended. We had lots of great questions, many more so than our 1 hour could allot for answers. So we wanted to take a little extra time and make sure we respond to some of the questions you had. So my name is Tim Garbinski. If you joined us last time, you would know that. I'm the Communications Director here at the NCEO, and I am joined by Executive Director Loren Rodgers.
Hello, Tim. Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the time today. I'm excited to get these questions answered. And I think we could just go ahead and dive right in.
Sounds good.
So, great. So just to start out, there was a question in the chat, not so much about the nature of ESOPs or how they work, but just a little bit about the current environment around them. In 2017, we had a graphic that showed around 6,700 ESOPs. And right now there has been a decrease. So there was some interest in why there has been a decrease in the number of plans, what's caused it, and maybe what we can expect from here.
Sure, absolutely. So there has been a little bit of a decrease, but it's a lot smaller than the person who originally asked that question saw. They saw that there used to be 6,700 ESOPs, and in the webinar, we were talking about 5,800 ESOPs. That's comparing apples and oranges because those 6,700 ESOPs include both privately held companies and publicly traded ones. That second number is just privately held companies. So if you take that 6,700, bring it up to the present, there's still a bit of a decline, but it's down to 6,400 companies. If you look at the number of ESOPs that are created in a year, they tend to, there's some created every year, some that disappear every year. The rate of companies creating ESOPs has actually been growing, not dramatically, but gradually each year that we've got data for. There were about 226 ESOPs created in 2014 and about 274 created in 2018. So the reason the number of ESOPs is shrinking is partly because more companies are terminating their ESOPs, which doesn't sound great, but in many cases, it's actually good news for the ESOP participants. By far the number one reason that companies terminate an ESOP is they got an offer to buy the business, usually at a very substantial premium over their last appraised stock value. When that happens, the employees immediately have their ESOP accounts turned from stock into cash at a much higher value than what was in their accounts before. So they end up better off. It's sad, it's no longer an employee-owned company, but it's still, in some senses, a good thing for the workers who get a real financial windfall from that. The other piece that looks like it's getting missed in these numbers is a lot of companies are now becoming employee-owned, not by setting up their own ESOPs, but by being acquired by a company that already has an ESOP. A fair number of our member companies have that baked into their business model, and the topic of acquisitions is one of the most popular topics at our annual conference every year.
That's interesting. I'd love to actually see more data on that at some point, especially around mergers and acquisitions, because it has been such a sort of a growing factor in the ESOP community. Even in just the last 3 to 4 years, the number of acquisitions I hear about is astonishing, which also just means more ESOP participants. It's a really exciting thing, but also, to Loren's point, the numbers then bear it out in ways that might not be obvious, right? So thanks for providing that clarity. Moving forward, we're going to move a little bit from the sort of scene setting. We're going to talk a little bit more about the nitty gritty of ESOPs and answer some of those questions now. Just around the sort of basics of how an ESOP functions. What happens to an employee ownership interest in the trust when they leave the company? Do employee owners get compensation with an exit event? How does that work?
Sure. So from a financial perspective, the ESOP is a retirement benefit. So it is designed for people to withdraw the assets from their ESOP account at retirement. And that is almost always what happens. And it does tend to really benefit employees. People have about 2.5 times as much assets in if they have an ESOP than in company-sponsored plans, and if they just have a 401k plan. And that's not counting that that actually more than half of the U.S. workforce doesn't have any company-sponsored retirement plan. So ESOP participants are a lot better off financially through retirement plans. They're also better off simply as employees. They've got a dramatically lower turnover, and turnover is really expensive. Changing jobs is really expensive for employees. You have to start again. You're off the growth path. You probably have some time between jobs. So there's that cost. That also contributes to employee owners' households having about 92% greater household wealth than non-employee owners. And then I'd say, and Tim, you see this as we attend conferences and things. I think employee owners really feel just personally more satisfied. Work is a bit more interesting when you're working together with everybody at your company and you all share the benefit. It's not just that I'm working to make my own account better. If I do something that's good for the company, everybody I work with is better off too.
I would agree with that 100%. The companies I talk to, whether it's from distance or in person at the conference, what feels like a long time ago, but hopefully won't be so far in the future from now as well. The companies I talk to, you're absolutely right. There is a more fulfilling aspect. They feel that sense of ownership, but they also receive a tangible benefit to that sense of ownership. And you really need both to create that sort of fulfillment. I would agree 100%. I want to touch on something you mentioned, which is, you related ESOPs to a retirement plan similar to a 401k. So speaking about that, the company pays for the shares, but is there a way for employees to contribute the same way they would to a 401k?
That's a great question. So there are two, well, you could divide this up a few ways, but there are two ways of setting up an ESOP. One is to make a standalone ESOP where it's just a pure ESOP plan. And in that case, no, it's not possible for an employee to make a contribution to it. You can, however, make a combined plan, which is both a 401k and an ESOP. That's called a KSOP. If you have a KSOP, and then what a lot of companies do is if an employee makes an employee contribution to the KSOP, then the company matches that contribution with company stock. So they make a matching contribution into the ESOP part of the KSOP. So that's a way that employees can sort of indirectly contribute to increasing the amount of shares they have. Now, ESOP, KSOP combinations are complicated. We've got a whole book about how to do it well, and there are a lot of options and alternatives. I just covered one of them, but there are a fair number of our companies, both publicly traded and privately held, that see the combination of an ESOP and a 401k as a really good fit for their workforces and their cultures.
Gotcha. And just to get to a really basic question that I know is going to be on a lot of companies' minds, how much does it generally cost to really execute an ESOP? How much does it cost to become an ESOP?
Sure, yeah. So the cost to create an ESOP, the transaction cost of setting up one, has a really big range. And I'm almost tempted to say you shouldn't even think of an ESOP transaction, but instead think about varieties of ESOP transactions and kind of try to price each one. You can do the cheapest possible transaction is a really simple, non-leveraged transaction where the company makes contributions from year to year, uses those contributions to buy shares. A more complicated one might be where the ESOP borrows a bunch of money and does a bigger transaction. Maybe buys 50 or 70 or 100% of the shares all in a single transaction. And then a really complicated one might be where you've got a big transaction that involves more than one source of debt. Like maybe you've got a bank doing some lending, you've got some mezzanine financing, maybe you've got a seller note, maybe you've got more than one buyer, maybe you've got a complicated ESOP structure. But but we don't have data on each of those types of ESOPs. What I can tell you is that in 2016, we did a survey of transactions, of ESOP transactions, and we asked people how much they paid for their ESOPs. And in the mid-teens, I think it's fair to say, of the people who responded to our survey, roughly 1/3 of them paid less than $75,000 to set up an ESOP. Roughly 1/3 of them paid more than $200,000 to set up their ESOP, and the other third was somewhere in between, of course. So there's a big range in how much an ESOP costs.
Yeah, no fooling. That is a big range. So, if there's a lesson there, it's that there's no such thing as one size fits all, right? So,
That's right, yeah.
And speaking of no size or no such thing as one size fits all, there was a question in the chat from our webinar. We did allude to the chance of these things not working out. There was a mention of United Airlines and sort of what happened there and what lessons may have been learned from what happened at United Airlines. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. United Airlines was the biggest, most public ESOP ever. It was 55% of the shares were owned by the ESOP. It was a dramatic union-led transaction. There was a lot of excitement. They were on the cover of magazines. It was a really impressive event. And then, of course, it flamed out. People ended up with the value of their shares in their ESOP account being far less than at the end of the ESOP than it was at the beginning of the ESOP. I'd say there are 4 takeaways from that, and there are lots more. People write about United Airlines in a really sophisticated way, but maybe four things to highlight. One is that it didn't cover everybody. The flight attendants union was originally part of the ESOP, but as part of putting it together, they opted out. And that ended up being a really big problem because the flight attendants are often the people that have the most chance to really affect the customer experience. They're the people you'd really want to have in the ESOP and caring about the fate of the ESOP. So that was one problem. Another big problem was the executive resistance. The top 2 executives, the CEO and the COO at United Airlines, were chosen by the unions as in order to be the two chief executives as part of the original transaction. So they were bought in. But the rest of the executive team, and at United Airlines, it's an 800-person executive and management team, wasn't involved in setting up the ESOP. They weren't particularly excited about it, and they didn't feel any real reason to support it. And many of them actively resisted the fulfillment of the ESOP, trying to make it a real thing. So there was a lot of resistance to making employee ownership all it could be at United Airlines. A third problem was union politics. The head of the pilots union. The pilots union had originally led the effort to create the ESOP, but there was a change in leadership. The new leadership of the pilots union was not that excited about employee ownership, focused instead purely on base compensation for pilots, had a very conflictual style. I don't want to place blame on this person. There are lots of motivations for someone who runs a union, but that ended up being bad for employee ownership at United. The fourth thing was 9/11. The attacks of 9/11, September 11th happened. That was terrible for the airline industry. It devastated the airline industry, including United Airlines. And that's something, of course, that has nothing to do with employee ownership. And unfortunately, that's one of the lessons too, that employee ownership doesn't inoculate a company from the outside economy. So looking back at all of it, United did a bunch of smart things. There were some flaws in the structure of their plan. But basically, when they first put it in place, they had some amazing results. Grievances filed by the unions fell by 92% in the first 18 months of the plan. They came up with lots of great ideas to make the company better. Everything was working as it should and as you'd want it to for the first 18 months. It was only after that that these 4 factors kind of stepped in and made things tougher at United.
Gotcha. I guess if there's another global lesson, it might be that, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that's going to work for every company, and there's no guarantee that the outside world isn't going to interfere in some way with best laid plans, right? And so
exactly,
I think that's one lesson to learn. And then also, for what it's worth, there are still ESOPs in other airlines. Southwest, I believe, still has one. Cape Air, a smaller airline, is a really wonderful ESOP company. So, it's specific to a single situation here with United for sure.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tim. I think one thing that was so sad for you and for me and all the people in the field was that United Airlines got so much press that it sort of became associated with employee ownership overall. But most employee ownership is in smaller companies that aren't household names. And there are all these stories of just quiet, non-dramatic success all over the place. And this one company with all this publicity could undo so much of the good that all these smaller companies were doing.
Yeah, I think that's a lesson for us in the field, perhaps, but a lesson for people at large that also, your mileage may vary, but also there's no one company that represents all employee ownership can be, right? Like we said at the very beginning, ESOP businesses, like any other business, are beholden to sort of the general life cycles of the business world. Some persist for a long time, some are born and then die eventually, or what have you. And it's a part of the way businesses run. ESOPs are, at the end of the day, a business. So I think that's a really good lesson to learn. And also, ESOPs ending isn't, or terminating isn't always a bad thing, like you had mentioned as well. And that's also just sort of a natural life cycle of it. So I think not placing undue importance on any one ESOP story is also a really good lesson to learn there. So thank you for providing that color and that background. I think that's important for people to hear. Moving a little bit forward to the sort of setting up and the structure behind it, talking a little bit about S corporations, C corporations, et cetera. Can ESOPs be set up as S corporations, C corporations? What's sort of the practice there around how ESOPs are then incorporated?
Sure. So ESOPs can be set up in both S corporations and C corporations. When ESOPs were first created back in '74, it was just C corporations. But in 1997, a new law was passed. It took effect in '98 that allowed an S corporation to have an ESOP. And since then, there's been a huge transformation in the field. More and more of our member companies are S corporations. A number of companies converted from S corporation to an S corporation ESOP. Some C corporations with ESOPs converted to S corporations. So yeah, it's possible to do both. The tax implications are different for S corporations and C corporations, but the incentives are pretty powerful for both.
Gotcha. And what about LLCs? What about an LLC, say, for instance, taxed as an S corporation? Can they do an ESOP?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. An LLC cannot do an ESOP unless it is taxed as an S corporation. But if it is, there's no barrier to them having an ESOP.
Okay, good. All right. So there you have it. There's still the flexibility there. Getting a little bit back to just the nuts and bolts of how it works. So how does the ESOP get the funds to pay the purchase price?
The ESOP gets the funds through company contributions. So the company is always the source of the funds that are used by the ESOP to acquire shares. Always is maybe a little too strong. There are a couple examples here and there of companies allowing employees to use 401k assets to purchase shares through an ESOP. But in general, in almost every case and almost all shares, it's originally a company contribution that goes to the ESOP. The ESOP uses that contribution to buy shares.
Understood. You had mentioned a little earlier about some of the sort of positive aspects of the ESOP and the sort of win-win-win nature of it, and about sort of employee turnover. Are there any statistics on how much employee turnover is reduced after the implementation of an ESOP?
Yeah, there are some really compelling ones. The General Social Survey is a representative sample of the whole U.S. workforce. It gets asked every 4 years, and it's got a question that asks the people who respond if they're a participant in an ESOP. So they were able to look at a whole bunch of different variables, and one of the most amazing outcomes was what you just raised, Tim, about turnover. So if you look, depending on the year, they've done it a whole bunch of years now, the employee turnover in ESOP companies is between 1/6 and 1/4 as much as for non-employee owners. So I don't mean a reduction of 1/6. I mean, it's literally 1/6 as many people who are employee owners experience turnover compared to people who are non-employee owners.
That's pretty drastic. What what specifically occurs at ESOPs that sort of has that impact? Like what can a company do to reduce their turnover?
An ESOP CEO one time said to me that, when I'm looking at the workforce, trying to figure out how we invest, what kinds of things we do, he was thinking specifically about a wellness program in this case. But he said, those are my shareholders. So I think uh, whether it's companies that begin companies and leaders that start with a different conception of what the responsibility of companies is to their workforce, or whether the ESOP changes their perception of the role and the importance of employees in the company. Either way, ESOP companies tend to weigh employee interest and benefit and the reduction of turnover specifically more highly than people in other companies.
Gotcha. Gotcha. We had a question in the chat that was specifically from a company that has high turnover. They were
Yeah.
wondering what they can do. So what sort of things are they able to do with regards to vesting or things in that sort of realm?
Sure. Yeah. Vesting is a great example. You've got flexibility about how vesting works. So a number of companies choose to have a vesting schedule that means people who leave get either less or forfeit some of their ESOP accounts. So they need to stay for 3 years or 6 years, depending on the vesting schedule, to get all of the value in their ESOP account. So vesting is one thing. The longer people stay in an ESOP, the more allocations they get into their ESOP accounts. They'll get an allocation every year that they remain an employee. So the longer they stay, the more they benefit. And those are dollars and cents things. Some things that companies do is they do a very focused job of education, trying to explain to people. They might be business literacy or financial planning education, and that helps people understand how the ESOP fits into their own personal um, financial planning, their own retirement planning, for example. Another thing companies do is really focus on the culture. You've probably heard that saying that people don't quit a company, they quit a boss. So a lot of the ownership culture comes from building a company where the whole organizational structure is more aligned around making work fulfilling, giving people good reasons to stay. That's sort of the real soft touch side of making a company a good place to work. And we've both seen this, Tim, all the companies that do really creative things in business literacy and involvement programs and celebrations and all sorts of things to really build a sense of family.
Yeah, that's true. We see that all the time that they go above and beyond in the cultural aspect. And I think you're right that it's sort of combining that intangible, perhaps cultural aspect with the very tangible, realizing the value of your ESOP account over time and knowing that it's going to grow over time with all you put in, effort wise, that is to say, really does have that tangible turnover benefit for ESOPs. Speaking a little bit about realizing the value in growing or expanding companies, you would imagine that the valuation is going to increase year to year. So how does the change in value of the business impact the ESOP specifically?
Sure. So the most obvious way is that when the value of a share of stock increases, the value of, well, every share of stock increases. So that means every employee that has an ESOP account has the value of that account go up. Great thing. Everybody's happy about that. It makes for easier conversations around the dinner table, as they say. The other thing it does is it increases how much the company is going to need to pay to buy back those shares when employees leave the company, when they retire. So that is something. It's called the repurchase obligation, and it's something that ESOP companies spend a fair amount of time planning around. They spend time making projections of their repurchase obligation, figuring out how to make sure they're ready to cover the repurchase obligation. There are lots of ways to do it. And we have sessions at every conference. We often have webinars specifically about the repurchase obligation and what steps companies have available to them to make sure it all works well. One other thought on that, one of the premises of the question is that the stock is going to increase from year to year, and hopefully that's true. A lot of our member companies didn't have that experience this year. They've seen their values decrease. And it's a good exercise for companies to get ahead of that and make sure that people understand that stock goes up on average more than any other type of asset, partly because it is risky and it can go down too. It's good for companies to be upfront about that so that employees understand and aren't caught off guard if there is a year where the stock price goes down.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of companies are giving a lot of thought to now and have in recent years, even before this downturn, thankfully, but just exactly how you communicate the implications of one's ownership in the ESOP. And what it means to see a dip or what it means to see it rise. I think setting those expectations, being clear, and making sure you're communicating about those things goes a really long way, as we've seen with a lot of the companies we work with. Our next question switches gears a little bit, and it's a little bit about the flexibility of who's in the ESOP. So does the ESOP have to include part-time employees, for example, or even freelance workers, or who, aside from full-time workers, is involved in an ESOP, or how is it determined who is actually in the ESOP?
Yeah, good question. So contractors are not in the ESOP. In terms of part-time, the law that governs ESOP says that everybody who works 1,000 hours during a plan year and meets the other eligibility requirements needs to be a participant in the ESOP. Those other eligibility requirements are having been employed a full calendar year and being age 21 or higher. 1,000 hours is just shy of half time. So anybody who works half time or more in a calendar year, it needs to be an ESOP participant. They need to be in the plan. People also need to meet that 1,000-hour requirement every year in the future in order to get an allocation of shares into their account for that year. So now that 1,000 hours is the highest threshold that companies can have. And many of our member companies have lowered that threshold. They've said anybody who works 800 hours or 600 hours is going to be a participant in our ESOP. That's the opposite of the direction the person who asked the question wants to go. But we've had a number of companies that have people like McKay Nurseries has people come by every season to work in the tree nurseries, and they don't get to 1,000 hours because they're only there for part of the year, but they do come back year after year after year, and McKay wants those people in their ESOP, so they lower the 1,000 hours to get more people involved.
Interesting. So hopefully that clears that up for anyone with the questions around eligibility between part-time and full-time. There's a few more questions we're going to tackle here in no particular ranking or priority or order. So forgive the occasionally slapdash nature of some of these questions. This next one is just a little bit about the different types of employee ownership. So there was a question a little bit about, worker cooperatives and what they are compared to an ESOP. How are they structurally different from an ESOP?
Sure. So they're different on several different dimensions. A worker cooperative is defined by each state. So every state has its own legal definition of what constitutes a worker co-op. Some states don't have a definition, so people can call themselves a worker co-op even if they don't meet any particular objective definition. But there is a federal definition that applies for a few tax reasons, but basically worker cooperatives are defined by each state. An ESOP is purely a federal creation. So it's clearly and solely designed by federal retirement law, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. An ESOP itself is a retirement plan, whereas a worker co-op is a form of organizational structure. So that's one difference. They're kind of different types of things. So you can be an ESOP-owned company, or you can be a worker cooperative. Another difference is that a worker cooperative is, by definition, in every place it exists, it is a democratically run organization. So everybody who's a member of a worker cooperative has a one person, one vote influence on the direction of that worker cooperative. An ESOP is indirect ownership. The trust owns shares, and the participants in the trust can vote those shares. So if I have half as many shares as you do, then I get half as many votes on any voting issues as you would. So that's one big difference. That's the second big difference. A worker cooperative needs to be non-discriminatory in who becomes a member of the worker cooperative, and that's actually a similarity. An ESOP can't have any form of discrimination either, just the same way that no company in the United States can have any discriminatory hiring policies.
Gotcha. You mentioned a little bit. You mentioned briefly the sort of direction of the company. Voting shares and what have you, and that a worker cooperative, it's one share, one vote. So it's in that respect, it's a simpler structure. And there was some confusion, and this is a common misconception about how then is the board formed? How is the governance then? How does that take place in an ESOP? So, for example, many companies, when they sell to an ESOP, the selling owner still sits on the board. So even if you sell 100% of your shares, it's possible for the former owner to be on the board. But is that a requirement? How does that typically play out? How does that work?
Yeah, good question. And it is a complicated answer. So this, we'll talk about it briefly here, but this is something that people may want to dig into a little bit more for their own situations. But the short version is that a sale is a sale. If Bob owns a business, Bob sells to an ESOP, the ESOP is now the owner and Bob no longer is. And the ESOP is, as the shareholder, is the ultimate controller of the business. The ESOP, as that shareholder, is legally bound by federal law to operate solely in the interest of plan participants. Now, that means in their interest as plan participants. It doesn't mean that it needs to think about their good as an employee or a person. It needs to think about their good as someone who holds an account, a retirement account in the company. So the ESOP can't take any other interest into account, but the ESOP does aim to be not to second guess the company. ESOP trustees do their best not to intervene, and a company needs to behave fairly egregiously before the ESOP has an obligation to step in. If the CEO of the company is pulling out all of the company's profit as a bonus, that's egregious. The trustee has an obligation to step in. One thing that many trustees do is they insist that when the ESOP is put in place, the company bring on outside directors, non-employee directors onto the board. And those directors, like all directors, when they're wearing their board of directors hat, their legal obligation is to the shareholders, in this case, to the ESOP. So the directors, the standard of their performance is acting in the interest of the shareholder of the ESOP. Now, that said, the directors are protected by the business judgment rule, which means that the shareholders and the courts give a lot of deference to the best judgment of the directors, and they rarely intervene in how the company works.
Understood. So yeah, like Loren just said, though, that's That's a very big topic that's worth diving into if you're considering an ESOP. We're, of course, happy to answer questions and have more conversations about that one, as we are about all these other topics for what it's worth. But definitely worth doing your due diligence on all of these things. So, we've talked about a lot of different topics here, a wide variety of sort of implications of what it means to be an ESOP or how to become an ESOP or what to expect when you're an ESOP. So how could somebody who wants to encourage somebody to be an ESOP, say a business coach or an exit planner or whatever, how can they best present the ESOP idea to their clients and then also best match their clients with the right ESOP advisors?
Good. Tim, I think I expect you've seen the same thing I have, which is that a lot of people who know ESOPs, who like to encourage companies to do ESOPs, they love what they do. And they often lead with kind of the technical details and the tax implications and the different structures that are possible. And I don't think that's the right way to approach somebody who's considering an ESOP. I think what we've seen be a lot more effective is to start with motivation, help people understand if an ESOP is something they want, if they want their company to be employee owned, if they want their employees to own their business after they do. And the best way to do that is stories. And the best person to tell the story is not an advisor or a business coach. It's a peer. It's somebody else who owned a business and made a decision about how they were going to exit that business. It'd be somebody like Ashley Walters. And I think if we start there, then all the other stuff falls into place. If somebody's not motivated, then they shouldn't pursue all the other stuff. If they are motivated, they'll figure everything else out. The other question that person asked is, how do you connect the people with talented business advisors? And we at the NCEO have a service provider directory, which is a great way to get connected with service providers. These are people who invest in the field and are really engaged in making sure they know their stuff. Another good approach is to come to a conference or speak to webinar presenters or come to the fall forum, and then you can talk to people and have a conversation to decide who feels like a good fit as a possible advisor.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, especially on that first point. You're absolutely right that leading with what your expertise might be depends on what your expertise is, right? So if you're very good at the valuation stuff, it's important to know, but it's not necessarily the strongest selling point. And I'd say, I don't want to say 100% because I don't like it being absolutist, but almost everybody who sells to an ESOP, the common denominator is that they want their employees to own their business. They see a sort of larger narrative to it, and they want to do something beyond themselves, whether it's for their legacy, whether it's for their workforce, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and you have a lot of those conversations, Tim. I mean, I think it's been great to see you gather all these first-person narratives and the videos you're working on. I think that's a great way to make sure people can see a real peer of theirs when they're thinking about an ESOP.
Exactly. It's really, you got to learn from the mouths of somebody who's done it. That first-person experience really, goes very far in trying to communicate what we want these business owners to understand, which is the implications for their real life. We don't live that real life. We help them to do it. But we know the business owners who have done it, and we're happy to put people in contact as well. So yeah, thank you for providing that extra info there, especially about the service provider directory as well. So once you get to that stage of trying to link people up, we of course have that resource, but just integrating yourself into the community and sort of getting a feel for who's out there, what they specialize in, what they're, what sort of companies they work with. All of that comes with just, becoming familiar with the employee ownership community. So I think those are both, spot on pieces of advice. Another somewhat non sequitur question about just setting up an ESOP, which is how long does it take to set one up? Like, what's the average duration you would say to set up an ESOP?
Well, we have data. The transaction survey that we talked about before says that the average time to set up an ESOP from the decision to do it and when somebody does a feasibility study until the time all the paperwork is signed is on average 6 months. If you look at the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, then the range is 4 to 9 months. We've seen companies take a year, and we often see companies take a really broad amount of time between when they first start thinking about an ESOP until they actually do. I know we had a company call the other day that said, I heard one of you speak 10 years ago, and now we're ready to start thinking about it.
Yeah, well, just like we said before with the cost, there's no one size fits all, and that holds true here as well. So again, as always, your mileage may vary, but there's flexibility in there, of course, is what that also means. Speaking of flexibility, what is, I don't know if we actually touched on this, but what is the minimum percentage of share required to be sold to the ESOP? How much to sell to an ESOP before you're actually considered an ESOP? Like what does that look like?
It's 0% actually, odd as that may sound. And companies can put just cash into the ESOP and have that cash sit in the ESOP for some time, some years. Generally up to 5 years is okay. So once the ESOP, once it has cash, it needs to eventually buy shares. But we do have a fair number of member companies that have 0% of their shares in their ESOP. I guess the more real answer is that a lot of companies have very small percentages in their ESOPs. You mentioned Cape Air earlier, Tim, and they've got a business model where they maintain a minority of shares inside the ESOP, although it goes up or down. Publicly traded companies could have 0.5% of their shares in their ESOP and just maintain that minimal level for years and years and years. And then the most common percentage of shares owned by an ESOP trust is 100%, and it has been ever since that S corporation ESOP law was passed.
Gotcha. And then I believe, if I'm not mistaken, for the C corporation benefits to be realized, you have to sell a specific amount as well to the ESOP. Is that right?
That's right. For the C corporation benefits, which is a deferral of capital gains tax, the ESOP has to own at least 30% of the shares after the transaction. So you could sell 25% of the shares and not get any deferral of capital gains. Then next, if you sell 5% or 6% of the shares, you would get the capital gains deferral on that because the ESOP would own 30% after your second transaction.
Gotcha. Yeah, I wanted to touch on that just because I very often, as I'm sort of looking in the news about new ESOPs, see that they've sold around 30% to start. And I think that, plays a big factor there, that sort of cap gains deferral. So one more question. It's a little bit of a specific one, but I think it's worth touching on here. This is, of course, from one of our attendees. New York State restricts professional companies, which is to say doctors or lawyers or veterinarians, et cetera. So it restricts professional companies' ownership to the licensed professionals themselves. So only the doctors, only the lawyers, what have you. How does that impact an ESOP in New York or other states with the same laws?
Yeah, thanks. This was probably going to be the least satisfying answer of our whole conversation here, Tim. Unfortunately, it does vary from state to state, and it varies from profession to profession. I can tell you we have a lot of dental practices that have ESOPs. We've got CPA firms, which are often subject to the same requirements of professional company ownership, and architects that do have ESOPs. I can tell you that there was a recent Connecticut law that passed just 2 years ago to allow architects and other firms that are subject to the professional licensing requirements to have an ESOP. So unfortunately, the answer to that is it's going to depend on your state and your profession. It is possible in many states for many professions, and it often involves setting up 2 separate companies. There may be one company that has the ESOP and then a second company where all the professionals are employed. And then how you structure that, you'll need a lawyer familiar with this to make that happen right.
Gotcha. And we had a question come in the chat just now, so I'll go ahead and put that to you real quick, Loren, which is how long does it take when the paperwork starts? So once once the paperwork starts rolling, so, you know, not somebody who's thought about it for 10 years and then calls us, but somebody who's like, all right, got my lawyer, got my team going, here we go. How long does the process then take to get to an ESOP? And of course, I know it's flexible, but just a little more color there.
Yeah, good. Thanks for asking that, Tim. That actually is the 6 months. It does take a fair amount of time from hiring the first professional to having the paperwork signed. And that's partly because there are a bunch of steps in the process. Most companies need to have a pretty thorough review of their books. Maybe they've already had an audit and they don't need it, but they may need to have some review of their books. Then it'll take some time to get the valuation done after that. And when the valuation is done, there's still a bunch of work that needs to be done to figure out the terms of the deal and the structure of the deal. And then there's also all the work to set up all of the administration, how each employee will interact with the plan. So that 6 months is actually the time from when it starts until the deal is done.
Understood. All right. Well, thank you for providing that extra color there. That actually puts us right here at time. So I believe that will do it for us. I just want to thank you again, Loren, for your time today, for providing your expertise on these answers. I know that, you know, again, with another hour, there's so many more questions and answers we could have gone over, but I think this will have to do for now. To our attendees or anybody who ends up watching this later on down the line, as always, we are very happy to have your questions come to us anyway. So if you have any questions, you can email us. We'll make sure you have our email addresses. You can always give us a call. We're happy to chat and help you sort of navigate any uncertainty or any other questions you might be dealing with. And of course, we have other resources on the website. I believe by now, some of you watching this will have our ESOP Essentials. So you will have quite a few things to read and watch on our website, quite a course there available to you. But if that leaves you with more questions, as it likely should, we're happy to help direct you there as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We wish you much luck on your journey to employee ownership and hope we can be helpful as you move down that path. So thank you.
Thank you.